Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending the meetup. Thank you very much for the generous introduction to today's Kafka User Group meetup. I'll start with today's presentation, tiny summary. So what are we going to talk about? So for the most advanced Kafka users, if I can have who would consider themselves as introductory to Kafka, just started to use it, roughly, show of hands. All right. Good part of this group, and who has been running multiple Kafka clusters in production with customers asking for absolutely crazy things. Right, seems about half and half. Right, so today, what sadly I'm not going to be talking about is deep dive into Kafka and a lot of details, because that would take somebody a lot more interesting and intelligent about it. What we're going to be talking about is what we've been doing in Sainsbury's and specifically in the supply chain area. Our journey for Kafka, because it literally started as I started the job, so kind of a boom, here, off you go. And how we implemented best practices in order to achieve as good as we can make Kafka work for us. Right, so about Sainsbury's, there is so much to say about Sainsbury's, and I actually, for one, love what's on the About Sainsbury's page, because that truly reflects our values in many different ways. And the important thing for today, actually, to keep in mind for a little later, is that Sainsbury's is a group as well, and we've got Argos, Habitat, TUI, Nectar, and other different things that are part of the Sainsbury's group. So it's not just Sainsbury's, the grocery stores as you know them, it's actually a lot more other companies. So just very quickly about me, because that's not the important part of it. I think I am of myself as an open source contributor. I do a lot of different things to try to help people or help myself, really. Let's be honest about it. An ABS community builder, that's just a thing I do. I've been using ABS for many, many different years, and I love it. And I suppose for today, the important part is I'm a principal cloud engineer, which really means it's been my responsibility to help and help the other cloud engineers in my team and help the development teams towards their journey into adopting Kafka. So supply chain, what is supply chain? So there is so much that can be said about what a supply chain is. I suppose the important thing to think about is what happens if the supply chain fails. First of all, we've all lived through COVID recently, I believe. So think of it as if the supply chain breaks, no more items go on the shelves, and it's a big problem for a lot of people. But it also means that any problems of any kind, data corruption, the Kafka cluster goes down, whatever you can think about, this is going to drive a big loss of revenue for us. And potentially the problem is if we lose information, it can start a whole nightmare of having to reconcile data through and through for all of this. So at the very beginning, when we started this transformation, and bonus points for somebody who knows what this is a reference to. Any takers? No? This is from a show called Severance, where literally she is grabbing data, she doesn't know what it is, putting it in a box and figuring out whether or not she completes the task that she's got to do. So at the very beginning, we had a lot of CSV files that are managed around, move around into different mainframes, and it goes from one system to the other, and then you process it, and then you get the output, and you move it to the next one. A lot of SQL databases, and obviously, all of this is driven by batch timing, so it can be quite time-consuming potentially, meaning that you have only really two windows, the start of the day or the end of the day. Some of the systems have different timings during the day, depending on whether the stores close early or not. So a lot of very different complexity, and it makes it very difficult for the business to be able to know what the stocks are in what stores, what's needed, what needs to be purchased, and so on and so on. So, like I said, different formats, different schedules, and that is really where supply chain as a transformation program became a thing, where we thought we need to standardize this for not only for Sainsbury's as the grocery stores, but also we need to find a way to make it multi-channel, multi-domains for all of the different brands. So this is a tremendous effort to try to get all of the different companies that are part of the group into this thing. And this really is to do a few things. Better forecasts to meet customer demand, And one thing I'm particularly proud of is to have witnessed one of the team, and I don't see any of them here tonight. Reduce waste here is something as simple as 2021, I want to say, in summer 2021, we partnered with Neighborly, and through our adoption and the transformation that we've been able to do for Kafka, we've been able to tremendously reduce waste by doing a lot of donations. So Neighborly is a partner that we tell them, we've got this much things, please come and pick it up so that you can donate it to people who might be in need. Right, so the current state is pretty straightforward. We've got many clusters across different vendors, and some of them are self-managed. So we end up with a lot of different configuration and all that sort of things. It's pretty fun. For supply chain, for supply chain only, this is about 30,000 partitions. If I did an update today of this number, it probably would be a little bit up across 7 different clusters. That number also already changed about 2 weeks ago. I probably should have updated the slide, which is now 9 clusters. And it's just starting to scale to a number of things. So really the question is, how did we go from a place where we had just a few clusters to a place where we have multiple clusters, many different teams, many producer teams, consumer teams, and all that sort of things, and make it so that it doesn't go all wrong? So yeah, early days, literally, hey, here's Kafka. So like I said, I had never used Kafka prior. I knew of Kafka. I used streaming applications, things like AWS Kinesis and all that sort of things, but really didn't have the experience. What we found across the team is we didn't have a ton of knowledge. So you go to figure out documentation, and there's either not enough documentation to help you really to go through your journey. You spend a lot of time watching other Kafka user group meetups, true story, to understand how to do things about right. Sometimes it's too much information. You really just don't know what this is yet until you actually experiment with it. And roughly when we onboarded with Kafka, we found that there were some toolings, a lot of open source tooling. So obviously, as an open source person, I'm very keen to do that. But a lot of the time, it was extremely opinionated, partially maintained, and sometimes it just ends up into, you don't really know what to do. So first of all, first thing we did is let's ask our neighbors. So as we started our journey, other people in the business were using Kafka. And so the first thing we did is learn from the others. So as much as Yoda says, do it, don't try, you actually end up trying by just doing it, failing, doing it, and eventually it works. The only thing really is don't get discouraged, I would say. You're going to get it right. You're going to get it wrong. Eventually it will work. And then we ended up with those 2 little different things here, which is really, there is a pattern. How do we ensure that we can put some guidelines, some rules in place so that we adhere to a pattern that will lead us to a successful continuous deployment? And so, I'm sure somebody else came up with this data as a product wording, but this is one I really, truly believe in, where you have to start to really think of the data that you're producing, that other people in your business are consuming as a product. We'll see in the few ways that we've implemented that later on, ways to do this in a very good, consistent way. But really, I think the first one, and this is something that you'll probably see everybody on Reddit or Stack Overflow, that sort of thing, is tell you have a naming convention. And most importantly for me is make sure you get a regular expression that you can parse. And that was a number of reasons. It allows you to identify at a glance who might be the producer of that topic, and so on and so on. This sort of details that at a glance, when you look at the name of the topic, you immediately know where it's coming from and potentially what type of data you'll find into it. And the other thing, and I found that to be absolutely genius. So I actually don't remember on top of my head who came up with this idea, but we've implemented the notion of having public topics, and private topics. The private topics, it's, for lack of a better word, it's garbage. That's the data you should be able to purge at any time. And the only thing that will be affected is the microservices that talk to each other, but you'll be able to reset. And the impact on the rest of the business is very minimum. The public topics are, as the name would suggest, for the public consumption of other people in the business. And these are the topics you really care about. So these are the topics for which you'll want to implement those rules. And potentially, if you had to have a disaster recovery strategy, this is where you want to spend the time and focus on doing it. So we started with 3 simple rules. First one, a version identifier is, and again, we use that for public and private topics, but specifically for public topics, with a version number. Why a version number? If you've, and again, we'll see that in a few slides. When you think of today, if you're a website and you're publishing an API, you'll have an open API spec. You'll give it a version. Maybe it will be a beta for a little while, but once the version 1 is published, you're not going to you're not going to change anything that will break your consumers, because that might actually break your business. So don't do that. Public topics must have a schema. So again, this is something that everybody talks about: schema registry and have schemas. This, again, will have specific slides on that, and that's kind of what I was talking about with the versioning. So what we've done is we kind of try to put in Tango those 2 things. So the public topics have a version, and the schema for that version is always compatible. And after the first message has been produced, you can't change those things. There might be other settings on top of my head that would be really bad to change, but these 2 were identified as the thing that breaks everybody. So the partition count is something that can mess your ordering. And obviously the retention policy might not be such a big problem to start with, but if you're using something like Replicator and you're on Confluent Cloud, for example, you can't change from one policy to the other, and that might actually break your Replicator. And then finally, like I said, again and again, schemas. So again, the easiest way to think about it is a schema to be a bit like your Open API spec API. Once you published it to your consumers, whether it's if you have B2B or B2C or whatever sort of API that people are going to consume, you want to stabilize that. And then if you're going to create new versions in the future, you restructure it and you call it V2. So exactly the same system. It allows, I could just read the slide, but it allows all of those things in a very easy way. You're able to identify what the data, the structure is consistent. And most importantly, to finish, so schema registry has this notion of compatibility. So you could publish messages in a specific schema, and on the same topic, publish other messages with a different schema. And obviously, you can change the strategy of the topic name of the subject naming. But if all goes in well, what you want to do is to make sure that the work is always on the producer side and not on the consumer side. And the reason for it is, if you've got hundreds of consumers and you start publishing messages they don't do, you're not actually certain. Also, although I would agree that it's not the producer's job to make sure that people have implemented DLQ or FAILQ and all sort of things, but if you want to just quote unquote be nice to everybody and make sure you're not going to mess everything up with a single change, you're going to want to make it so that compatibility enforces the work on the producer side and not on the consumer side. Right. So then, once you come up with some of the things, there's a few more things to do. You want to automate the provision of resources. This is the one thing that really unlocked our ability to scale to n number of clusters. Look at your topic. I couldn't come up with a smarter way to call it, but basically, you and your developers are going to need to figure out a way to look into the messages that you have across your clusters. And sometimes, there's tons of toolings. Again, I'm a big open source advocate, but a lot of them, one thing to keep in mind, if you are looking into those toolings, make sure that you're going to actually comply and have the tooling to avoid people looking at PCI DSS data or things that fall under some certain compliance policy. And finally, monitor Kafka. There'll be a caveat on this one. Right, so the first thing is GitHub. So how do you get to a model where you've got GitHubs? And that will allow you to do things that scale, like I said. And we ended up thinking about a model that will actually reduce the friction from the admin team. So we've put in place tools that allow the developers to be self-sufficient with their repositories, and we only validate their pull requests just to make sure that they don't try to create topics with 1,000 partitions, for example, all that sort of things. One thing I'm particularly keen on is the sharing the responsibility. Right? If you want to entrust your developers to the cloud, they share the responsibility of making sure that what they're creating in the cloud is actually going to make things work at the expected, at the expected performance. And the last one, keep it Apache Kafka native. Just a tip, in case you're changing vendors or you have to change cluster between self-managed to cloud or cloud to self-managed or whatever way you go. If your tooling only works with one cloud vendor, you'll have to redo the entire work. And thankfully, the Kafka protocol is open source, and it's my belief that so should the tooling. Monitoring Kafka. So the caveat here, as I was saying, is that for the rest of the other slides coming up, it is on the assumption that you're using a managed service for Kafka, right? If you are obviously doing Kafka clusters yourselves, some of this might not, you'll have a number of other things to manage, aka the brokers. So I really like managed services. As much as I'm open source, I love to pay somebody to care about problems that I don't want to be caring about. However, like I said, if your vendor does not expose GMX, for example, there's already a bunch of tooling that goes straight out the window because you'll have to integrate to theirs. Partition counts. That's what you. Topic and partition counts. Sorry. Yes. This is the thing you're paying for, because the more your clusters are going to scale, the more topics and partitions you're going to have, and so has the cluster got to grow based on that. And the last part. And again, it's more for admins, this slide. I've done different slides for different people. It's good to keep an eye on what's going in and out of the cluster, the number of clients, number of connections, that sort of things, how much the data is retained, how much does your cluster actually go. Because at the end of the day, this is the picture of your sales rep on the other side if you don't monitor any of this. Literally. Yeah. Right. So monitoring Kafka for developers. So there's so many metrics you can monitor, but I think these are the top two. The first one is the offset lag, the one that actually is going to tell you a number of different things, whether your consumer is performant enough, am I consuming and processing enough messages per minute, per second, whatever the scale that you have to work with. And I think the thing that, again, back to the cloud, and I'm a cloud engineer first, more than I'm a Kafka person, is you'll be able to scale the rest of the resources that you have in your cloud vendor based on that. So we have some teams, the most advanced teams that we have in supply chain, are able to scale their applications based on whether there is one message, 100 messages, or 10 million messages, and they will provision resources accordingly. Message size and count, that will mostly allow you to identify the people who are doing something a little funky, potentially. But it's always a good metrics to validate. Again, this is probably more something that you should you would do sort of a workshop with people to understand why that is important and why you want to optimize your keeping an eye on those two things is going to actually improve your throughput and the overall performance of your application, as opposed to trying to send jumbo frames every second. And then you can think, all right, okay, so we've got admins, we've got developers, and then we've obviously the C-level people, the people who actually care, because at the end of the day, they're paying for the bill. And truthfully, they actually don't really care about that. I mean, I'm sure they care about the bill for paying the clusters and maintaining it, but they care a lot more about what is Kafka actually offering to the business. And that is something that your application system is going to have to do. So implement metrics that will tell them. So for example, in our case, how many SKUs are processed? What's the volume of data that we're getting from our vendors that allows you to do purchase orders or forecasting, all that sort of information. Kafka is not going to tell you that. So you have to work and tell your developers and identify the KPIs that actually truly matter and surface it for the senior engineering team. Now, our tooling very quickly. And again, so the looking your topics thing that I mentioned before is called, that we're using is Connector Platform. That is a very good web-based. I have probably tried every single open source tool that there is out there. Some of them are excellent. I, for example, was a big fan of AKHQ. Kafka UI is also a very good one. But we've all gone through Log4j problems, and I tell you, a lot of open source Kafka problems, open source tools that we were using were actually quite far behind in updating their dependencies. So be careful out there, especially if you need to have people who are going to keep an eye on the monitoring. On the Kafka, on the lag part, so again, because we don't have access to the JMX with the setups that we have, we can't really ask the questions directly and do something like what AWS MSK would. So we deployed Kafka Lag Exporter, which is an excellent tool. It uses the Kafka admin API. It's extremely fine-grained, so you can say, so for example, we've got a structure that gives all of our different project teams a different AWS account. So what we did is we know those AWS accounts based, thanks to the naming convention that we talked about, they have topics that match their name. So what we do is we surface on their account only the metrics for their services and not the metrics for the rest of the business, because that would be, well, that wouldn't be of great use to them. Kafka Connect Watcher, that one is something that I created a few weeks ago, which is a, well, I should know what it is. Which is going to use the Kafka Connect API to literally scrub your connectors, and we'll be able to go into the details of, I want to scan these connectors, ignore those other ones, and based on what's going on with the connector, I want to try to do things like auto restart, or if it doesn't work after 3 times to try to auto restart, I'm going to just send a notification to whatever channel. Features requests and pull requests are most welcome. And on the automation side, this one also is something I had to create, which is called CFN, which stands for AWS CloudFormation, Kafka Admin. So originally, a lot of the tools that we had, like I said, were extremely opinionated. You had to already have a Kafka, or you should have used the tool since the very beginning. Something that Julie Apps was very opinionated about those things. And our CI, we have a CI/CD pipeline for all of our applications. So we were trying to treat the topics, the schemas, the ACLs in the exact same way. So to put that into our CI/CD pipelines, we just these are just Lambda functions that will make an API call to the Kafka cluster and create the resources as we need them to do. Again, this is using the Kafka admin API, so this is portable to any distribution of Kafka you might be using. Right. Well, yeah, that's one of my pet peeves. We have a number of teams that often go about, oh, we want to connect to this SQL database or extract the data or push the data into something like Snowflake and so on. And Kafka Connect is the answer, is the default answer that we're trying to push as much as possible to those engineering teams. And sometimes the connector, granted, might not be able to do exactly what you want to do, but don't reinvent the wheel. If there is a Kafka connector, and there's probably going to be one, whether it's a open source one or it's a vendor specific, like I said, Snowflake, for example, or MongoDB will maintain their own, subject to licensing or not. That's up to your relationship with them. But essentially, they are extremely well maintained. Again, the documentation, it speaks for itself. And we're using a lot of them. We have, I want to say, five or seven Kafka Connect clusters spread across different Kafka clusters themselves. And it is our de facto way to, for example, offload data into S3. Right? Don't go writing a microservice that does that. You really don't need to. As an outcome, putting all of this together has allowed us, and I know it seems pretty arrogant of me to say that, but nope, not a single production incident in 3 years. Because of that, because of any data corruption problem, or the topic is wrong, or that sort of things. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but that means that so far, in empowering the people, so our developers have the tool, we've built the tool, we've educated people, done shows and talks, and we all, every time we identify something as potentially being a bad practice, we try to correct it before it goes into production, and it has really been extremely helpful to us. Right. Next one. Right. So what are we going to do next? Because so far, we've gone from we didn't really know what to do with this to, okay, we've tried a few things that wasn't great, to implementing our own tooling or using the tooling that existed in order to get us into a very good position. And what's going to come next really for us is trying to break down. So I think that every company would agree that there is always a bit of a silo between business units. And one of the things that one of the great the things that bring me a form of joy working in Sainsbury's is that there's a lot of people who want to achieve the same goals. And when that happens, we truly come together and talk about those things. So one of the things we want to be able to do is try over the next year or two to come up with a common framework on how we're going to treat data across the business. And that includes little things such as, for example, before you go into production, everybody should go through the same sort of hell and fire tests before the application goes live, whether it's a producer or a consumer, and so on. Inject as much negative testing as possible. Use a managed, vendor. You think the brokers are never going to be the problem because it's not your problem to deal with them. But that doesn't mean that the underlying network can't go wrong. 2021 September, US East 1 and EU West 1 went down in Zone C for about an hour worth of networking problems. So you have to deal with those problems. And so as much as possible, you should try to make sure that everybody across the business adheres to those ideas. And then they'll go and implement it the way they want. Again, these are just really guidelines. It's not a rule. It's not enforced onto anybody. This is what we've chosen in supply chain to do because it works for us. And again, it goes back to finding the right tool and investing into the tool that you need to do that. In order to do this, we came across Conductor Gateway. That will be a nice segue to Tom right after that, which will allow us to do a number of different things, which we'll do for fantastic talks some of the time once we've made it work. That would allow us to really try as much as possible to do those two things: break down the silos between operational units, as much as adopting common practices and enabling features that will allow for a common development framework of our applications. And basically try to get everybody to the point where we don't have problems with any sort of data corruption or data that isn't topics that shouldn't be there. So yeah, as much as possible. Top one for me, I should have used numbers. Top one for me, adopt super early a lifecycle policy and put that under CI/CD. Whatever your CI/CD vendor of choice is, put that under CI/CD. That will save you a lot of trouble. It will depend on what you want to achieve, obviously. Again, monitoring, like I said, depending on the type of deployment that you have, monitor what you need. Don't try to monitor all the things. It's going to create more noise and a bigger bill to your monitoring vendor of choice. They'll be happy, not necessarily you, based on what you're trying to do. And again, I think the last part is the reason why we're here tonight, is share your experience with others, other business units, reach out, blog post. I try to do a blog post a month about the different things that we do, or about this sort of things. And this is really the best way to go on about it. There we go. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yep.
So a question about when you were starting off, a situation where you kind of landed as Deepak and you were messing around with CSVs and sequence. Two questions on that. Why were you told to just do it? And two, how did you go about kind of spreading that in your area?
Wow, loaded question. So, like I said, so Kafka was so supply chain adopted Kafka as a technology of choice to do event-driven message bus, whichever pops up systems. It's actually a good question, because one of the things and one of the reasons why I think I was a bit of a hard ass sometimes on imposing those rules on people who didn't want to follow those rules, is that the supply chain systems that work today that have experienced COVID, although they were on their knees every day when the toilet paper was off the shelves for everybody, they actually made it work. Right. And I think this is no little achievement for, systems that is potentially 10 or 15 years old. And one of the things that we were told is got to work. So the work that we're doing is to try to make sure that the new system that we're going to build will at least live up to that expectation. Now, obviously, the business has to continue running as it is. So that's why it's a transformation program. We still have to work with the integration of what already exists and take it to the cloud is one step, and take it into Kafka. And again, like I said, one of the reasons why we want to go away from big and heavy files as much as possible into Kafka is to enable the business to react faster to what might be happening in different places, react better to promotions or to a store closing because there's a thunderstorm, God knows what. But this is the sort of disaster scenario that you just can't do if you patch all your data twice a day. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Yes, on a similar aspect of what you spoke about, were you limited by the changes in the schemas that you were able to make because of integrations of existing platforms, or were you able to change the data model when you did Kafka work?
That is a better question for somebody who actually did it. I'll be honest with you. We haven't had much problems because, again, like I said, I'm the principal cloud engineer, so I manage more than I do on certain aspects of the doing. However, Sainsbury's had already a number of, CSV is pretty common. There was a lot of data that used GS1, XML, and that sort of format. So that gave a lot of the teams a baseline sort of data schema architecture. What does a payload look like? But again, because, and thankfully, given this is a greenfield for us, we've been able to be fairly flexible into doing what we want. And then again, like I said, the point is really that once you get into production, into one of those topics that everybody in the business is going to consume, that's it. Schema can only evolve forward and not backwards. There was one thing though, so like I said, we have CI/CD, we implement those rules, we have the full or forward transitive compatibility modes kind of enforced on those topics. One thing that I would still try to encourage is, as much as possible, iterate on your versions. But also, if originally when you start building the application, you don't really know exactly what the format is going to be, well, don't follow the rule right away. Because we have a team that ended up with version 59 in 2 weeks because they didn't know what they were going to do. So, and we have something north of 7,000 schema versions. So, apply the rule when it becomes important. But early stages, you still need to do the appropriate, discovery work to know what's going to work and really what makes no sense. So you shouldn't do it. Thanks. Yep.
Test that service. How do you guys handle story?
Good question. So currently, the easiest thing that we do is we start the services, reset the offset, start again. Right? It's very basic, but it has the merit to work. One of the things that we're going to be working on, which I'm sure Tom will talk about later, is we'll be working on an ability to create sort of ephemeral, short amount of time environments where somebody will be able to send all of the test data into that topic. The application that consumed that data will immediately get tested for it because they'll be connected to that same Kafka sort of environment. And then once they're done, move on. So yeah, but again, if this is something, it depends how it really, I love automation, but there's always a bit of a fine line between automating everything and not automating as much, because the return on investment might not be worth what you're trying to do. So one of the things that we're trying to do as much as possible, for example, is have when our CI/CD pipeline starts, that CI/CD pipeline has access to Kafka, for example. And so we could think of it as create a new consumer group ID, totally random, and start from the beginning because that's what you're going to do. But some of the thing that we've been doing very well is to have data that looks good, sort of package that into the app, not into the application, but in sort of the CI/CD pipeline, and use something like test containers to spin up Kafka, dump the data into it, and then move on. Yeah. Yep. I don't know. I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean by schema pattern? Yeah. Oh, the content of the payload is going to be relevant to what the producer is trying to put out there, right? So some people prefer sending lists of things, maps of things. It's really up to the application team. There's no mandate on that at all, because again, that's really up to the people who are implementing the producer and the ones that are actually doing it. So they'll know better what it is they need to produce. Now, with that said, there's a fair amount of time where a producer will start and produce the data in the version 1 that somebody else in the business wants, and then further down the road, somebody in the business says, actually, could you please enrich that data with something else, for example? So the schema is going to evolve with that. And because it probably will be a breaking change, that ends up being a new product, or it's into a new topic. Yeah. Good. Yep.
Which managed Kafka events do you use?
Confluent. Yeah, there's a good mix of Confluent, self-managed, proof of concept on MSK again. Now that there's IAM integration, that sort of things, for example. So, but again, it's a managed service, and at the end of this, kind of we're trusting that vendor and that partner to make it work for us. So yeah, it works well. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Sure. Right. So retention period, for example, is something that will be driven by your business needs. In the supply chain, the data that we have is extremely transitional, right? We might have to go back a little bit in time. So if we have to go back in time for, what I would do, what we've been pushing for example, if you have data that you need to keep for a long time, don't keep it in Kafka, put it into an S3 bucket with an S3 connector, move on. That'll do the job. If you don't need to reprocess it potentially 6 months down the road, obviously. So you would adapt your retention policy to that. But the data that we have is extremely transitional. We probably would not have much use for data that has been there for more than a couple of days. But again, you need to adapt those things. The rules really are on, if you are going to produce data into a topic that somebody in the business is consuming, that means that somebody is another entity that is not your own project team. So what evolves now is the number of topics you're going to have, V1, V2, V3, whatever. Again, as a suffix to the pattern. And there is, like I said, you can't change the number of partitions, because otherwise you're going to potentially break ordering very badly. And we've had a number of problems with that before early on. So we were like, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. And the retention policy, like I said, more so because we were using different connectors around, one of them being replicator, and that just breaks replicator. And for example, in Confluent Cloud, I can't remember on top of my head, but I think you can't go from like compact to delete or delete to compact policy, for example. So we just tell people not to change it. And if they do need to change it and go into a compact topic because it makes more sense, then they'll just create a new version. And what we do, and this is one of the patterns that this is actually something that's become a topic for the past 3 months, is how long are we going to keep producing the data of the previous version? So what's the grace period for consumers to migrate over? That's roughly done. But if the data is gone, it's gone. Right. Okay. So I love that question. Thankfully for us in supply chain, we don't have to deal with them. But it's not so. No. In all seriousness, this is a really good question, and this is definitely something that has come up. And in supply chain, we haven't needed to do anything to either try to obfuscate people. Again, you go into the conductor platform or whatever UI. We haven't had the requirement to try to obfuscate fields or to encrypt fields in the topic itself. So, but I did talk to other parts of the business who had those requirements, and not to be a conductor sales pitch. Hold on. Here we go. For example, Conductor Platform has an add-on in there to do data masking. So if you have data into a topic, again, should you have a schema which allows you to identify which fields you want to automatically obfuscate in platform. The data will be there. You just won't be able to read it, right? It will be little asterisks or something like that. And then again, I'm not gonna spoilers. Spoilers are there. So spoilers relates to. There is solutions that will allow you to do encryption on the fly of fields in your topics. And so typically there is a business unit that couldn't use Kafka for that reason. And so potentially there's now emerging solutions that would allow us to at least make that simpler. Because obviously you could do it now with encryption keys, but then you have to share the encryption key to everybody in the business, and that becomes another problem. So that's another pickle of its own. Yeah, great question. Yep.
How did you manage that switch, or what did you learn from the switch?
Right. So, all right. Like, I don't know if you're familiar to somebody called Corey Quinn, who is a cloud economist, whom I really like. Architecture and Bill are intricately the same thing. So what we've seen to be really bad is people trying to do in streaming batch processing. So there is a fair amount of complexity in what we're trying to do in supply chain system. So we're going to take the data from the source that exists today, supposedly it will be replaced by another system. In the middle is Kafka and our new microservices, and then is an output. But the output right now is not necessarily another new shiny microservices application that it's going to do. So then we have to find some way to feed that information back to the existing on-prem system. And this is where you generally you end up with something that is really weird looking and very expensive. But it is good effort because again, we can't afford again, forget about the margins and the fact that you're not going to make business. Sainsbury is a business that if it goes wrong, people don't get food and delivered and all that sort of thing. So we can't really afford to do such mistakes. So we're going through taking the pain of doing that until better days. But in general, it hasn't been catastrophic. But that allows us to do what we call parallel run, where a lot of the things today are feeding into the application, feeding it back, so that we can do a diff and make sure that we're not doing anything. And on the side of my eye, am I running out of time? What's happening? Right. Have we got time for one more question, or we good? Is there a quick one? Right.
I noticed that you had about 30,000 partitions. How much are utilized or close to utilization of using that is, because that can run many BBPS.
It's extremely low.
And is that related to the fact that I presume because you can't change positions, count later on, that you start with over-provisioned partitions and then you just set up again?
So that is something that has happened. So very early on, for example, we went with this very simple rule of thumb. There's 6 broker. I like 6. It's a factor of 2 and 3. We run either in 2 AZ or 3. So a lot of people have gone with the default of using 6 partitions, which probably was very overkill in many different areas. We had the case where we had to bump the number of partitions, and that is probably the worst trend. We've had teams who've had to change the number of partitions because not so much, it creates more latency on the producer, sure, but it's not so bad. But the problem is those teams had to drive the number of partitions up because the consumers on the other side were just not capable to cope with, that. I don't know what the consumers are doing. And this is one of the things that I fight most probably. Agreed, the idea is that for consumers to consume the data, right? But if the producer has a high level of throughput with the data, it's able to output. It's the job on the consumers to be able to match that, right? So again, try to do as much global first and bespoke then when it has to. Now, thankfully, I think the biggest number of partitions we have in topics for supply chain is probably 25. There are other areas of business where the number of partitions is 100. So your mileage varies a lot, but as much as possible, we're trying to tell people start small first, see what the throughput is, and then go ahead. And whenever possible, when we've got teams that need to do parallel consumer things, we just tell them, hey, actually, there is a library that allows you to do this. So you don't need to scale the number of partitions, just implement that into your client as much as possible. All right, thank you very much.